Welcome back to Candid Conversations on Leadership. Chris, today we are joined with a guest, James Quisenberry. Today we're going to be talking about, what are we going to be talking about today, Chris?
Servant leadership.
Servant leadership. Yeah. James, can you introduce yourselves to our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, I'm James Quisenberry. I work in student affairs. I lead the IT group over there, but I've been involved a lot with leadership on campus, part of the group that started the IT leadership workshop.
Wonderful. So let's tell our viewers and listeners a little bit more about what is servant leadership.
Yeah, so servant leadership is really this philosophy where the leader's primary goal is to serve others. It came out of an essay called "The Servant as Leader" that Robert Greenleaf wrote in 1970. So this is not a new concept. I was trying to do the math this morning. I think that comes out to 55 years ago, and so it's been around for a while. James, can you talk a little bit about your understanding of the concept?
Yeah, it is the idea that the leader isn't in the middle of things. The leader is going along, helping their team accomplish the goals and not necessarily getting in the way, but helping getting things out of the way of the team.
Yeah. So what are some of the traits of a servant leader? What do you think a servant leader kind of exhibits, Candice?
So there are 10 characteristics. I'm not going to talk about and memorize those, but I'll talk about some of them. So one of them is empathy. So really understanding and valuing someone else's perspective. There's listening. So really making sure that you hear and make space for someone else's voice. There's building community. There's also awareness, both self-awareness and organizational awareness. There is stewardship. So looking at people and the resources that you need for the community. There's commitment to growth. And there's also humility. So that's there. And why are these important? Well, mostly it's because you want to be able to build trust and really get people engaged. It also helps build morale with the team. And if you can do that, you can really make sure that people will stay with your organization, and it can help with retention. And also you can build collaboration, and you can also make sure that people are innovative. And more importantly, the most important thing is that you can create ethical and sustainable community cultures at your organization.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. James, from your perspective, how does this differ from maybe traditional versions of leadership? Why was this essay in 1970 kind of a revolutionary thing?
Yeah, and it started then, but it took a while for it to take hold. You look at the other literature about servant leadership, it's emerging throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s and 90s. And I think it kind of paralleled, generational change. How people wanted to be led played a big part of that. I think people don't usually unpack those different areas of servant leadership. I think a lot of people think of it in a kind of duality where my boss is supposed to take care of me more in that kind of servant leadership. But servant leadership is not necessarily about one-to-one relationships. It's about serving the organization and serving all of the staff, which sometimes requires accountability.
Yeah. What does that look like in reality?
Yeah. Well, that means that's why listening and empathy are some of the important factors there, because you need to understand where all of your team kind of is at to be able to serve them and the team both.
Yeah, absolutely. So Candice, where did you first encounter servant leadership?
So servant leadership was first introduced to me when I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois. I am involved and still involved in Alpha Phi Omega, which is a service fraternity. And our leadership, our core principles is leadership, friendship, and service. And so servant leadership, it's a volunteer organization. So our leadership core principles are serving others first. So the leadership program that we did, that was the core. So they talked about servant leadership. We have programs that we did, our launch course. They taught us this servant leadership model. So it said, hey, did you hear
so
about
you've had it as sort of part of your philosophy for a long time.
They showed us the pillar.
What about you, James? Was there a specific example?
I was fortunate to have two parents who modeled servant leadership. I mean, they were both educators, both committed educators, and had that mindset of bringing education to their students in high school, elementary school, college, wherever they were at. They were also both Rotarians, which is a service organization. Their motto is service above self. And you and I both have this connection with Scouting.
Yeah.
I grew up in Scouting, and Scouting has a strong focus on service to your community, to your colleagues. And so it was kind of built into how I grew up.
Yes, you mentioned Scouts, you mentioned your service fraternity. These are institutions that have been around for a long time, and they always had this sort of service aspect to them, like serving others in your community. I think there's a little bit of a different take when it comes to leadership. I mean, if this was a new concept to leadership in 1970, why do we think it's taken leaders of organizations kind of longer to get into this mindset of serving others? And
that's a good question. I will go back to, generational change and how people, how we've evolved through, Generation X and millennials and now Gen Z, how those individuals respond to leadership has changed quite a bit from the baby boomers, the greatest generation. Those were very comfortable with hierarchical models of leadership.
Yeah.
And we're now not in a space where the hierarchical model works anymore.
Yeah, I've actually found that there's this like real tension between sort of organizational efficiency and the efficiency of decision making and the agency and autonomy of the people on the team, right? And I think that servant leadership is sort of finding that balance of empowering people, giving them agency and autonomy, but at the same time, not letting that agency and autonomy turn into chaos in the organization. So, how do you find balance in that, either of you?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I think you should answer that first, though, Chris.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's a matter of deciding when and where that agency and autonomy matters. We have on our team, we have one of our sort of guiding values is this idea of disagree and commit. And those two things go together. So when we are coming up with solutions, that's when everyone's voices are at the table and you're very inclusive with things. But at some point, we have to get to a decision and move forward on things. And it's great if we can come to a consensus decision and everyone's like, yes, this is the way to go forward. But sometimes you can't do that. And a leader on the team, more often a manager on the team, a senior manager on the team, will say, okay, this is the way we're going to move forward on this. But then everybody has to commit to that. So there's a little bit of agency and autonomy lost at the end of that commitment if you didn't get your way, if your idea wasn't the one that went forward. But as long as the voices were present at the table when we were coming up with the solutions, I think that's how you kind of find that balance. And then you have accountability. You mentioned accountability earlier, James, that everyone then has accountability to that decision, even if it wasn't their idea to begin with.
I think one of the things that we mentioned earlier was humility. And I know there was kind of this discussion about, does humility and accountability go together? And I think there's a misconception about servant leadership that it's passive or soft. And I believe that you can serve an employee sometimes by holding them more accountable, because not being accountable can be a barrier to their success.
Absolutely.
And so you have to take this idea of being a servant to someone outside of what they may feel in the moment.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And have that more broad view. And I think that's where listening and empathy is very important, because you have to help your staff, particularly maybe the ones that aren't on the so-called winning side, understand why you're going that different direction and how it may play into their motivations that they don't feel like it's the right direction.
Yeah. It's definitely not just being nice. Some people think of it as that way. It can empower others, and it's really being compassionate, and it can be decisive.
Yeah, I think to maybe amplify what you said, James, is this idea of sometimes you can see somebody on your team getting in their own way, and you will sort of not give them what they're asking for, but give them what they need. Right. And I think the servant leader is the one that can make a distinction between those two things. Because a lot of times people will ask for things and it's actually not going to be good for them in the long run. You know, I'm not saying we should second guess what our team members say they want, but digging down underneath what they say to understand what they really want and need and help them get to that place.
Yeah, I think we have to help people understand that servant leadership isn't a duality. It's not like you and me, I'm serving you.
Yeah.
It may feel like that at times, and you may want it to be that at times, but a servant leader is really serving the group, the organization. Yep. Sometimes that may mean helping you in a particular place, but sometimes it may be helping the group, and that doesn't completely line up with what you specifically want. So
it's only a duality when you have a two-person organization, right? Because then that sort of encompasses the group. But there's so many times in my experience where the needs of one employee conflict with the needs of another employee, and I have to make a decision that's good for the organization. And hopefully I can align that to be good for those individuals, but I'm really serving the organization at the end of the day.
Servant leadership is truly strategic. It's fostering that development and then aligning all of the team goals with the individual strengths. So it's very much.
Yeah, I think that's a key developmental step for people who want to move from being an individual contributor or like technical lead to being a manager leader kind of role. They have to start seeing beyond what affects them directly and what their motivations are. And that's getting the heart of a servant leader.
So that actually brings up an interesting question, because when Candice and I did the live Candid Conversations last year, one of the questions we got from the audience was from a younger staff member who was earlier in their career. And I had talked earlier in the conversation about it not being about me anymore, that I was leading for others. I was leading for the organization, and I wasn't so focused on my personal advancement. And his question was, well, I'm still down here in the organization. If I start being all about others and all about the organization, how do I advance myself? And so, is servant leadership something that we evolve into over time? Or is it something we actually can do earlier in our careers and also accelerate our own careers?
So I'm going to take the guest prerogative here and ask both of you a question, because this is something I've been thinking about, which is, we can learn to be better listeners. There's ways to practice your listening skills. Can you learn to change your motivations? And because servant leadership means you have to have the heart of a servant, you have to want things for your team, for your group, not just for yourself. That's the humility part. How do you learn to change your motivations?
How do you learn to change your motivations? So I think that's a hard question. So I mean, I'll take a stab at it. So I think it's
it is a hard question.
It is a hard question. So usually I think it's all the small actions matter. So usually I tell people you have to be selfless. And so when I tell people, when they ask a question, sometimes you just want to learn about a person and you don't want to think about the end goal. So sometimes I ask people a question like, hey, how was your weekend? And I don't want to think more about why am I asking the person about their weekend? I just want to be in the moment, really listen to how their weekend was. Oh, tell me about it. Not what I really want to get at, which is okay, well, what's the next part? I just want to be in the moment. Okay, you went camping. Cool. Tell me about that. Because in my head, I'm okay, after she tells me about the camping, I want to ask this next thing. I want to just invest in camping. Okay, cool. And tell me that. And then if I forget about the next thing, that's what I want to just do. And so I tell people, just forget about the next thing, just invest in the person. So active listening is the thing that you have to focus on. And so just be there and show empathy in the person, and just that's the only thing you can focus on. So just do that.
That's a great answer, Candice. I've been sitting here thinking, I was trying to actively listen to you, but I was also formulating my own. It's hard. It's hard to do. It's a really difficult thing to do. But I'm going to go to something that I read in the book Atomic Habits. I think the author is James Clear. I may get the last name may be wrong on that. But he talked about when you want to change your motivations and you want to change your habits, you have to think through the lens of an identity. And you say, I am a servant leader, right? You say, I want to be a servant leader, and therefore I have to act in this way. And so instead of just trying to act in that way, you have to think about, if I were a servant leader, this is the way I would act, and start acting towards that. So it's an aspirational thing. And I think that's how we all evolve. We sort of see where we are, we see where we want to be, and have to figure out what are the behaviors we need to get there. How do you do it, James?
Well, so, we talk about the why of why we do things.
Yeah.
I think exploring that is important for someone who wants to evolve that way. And each of us are involved in things outside of work that are service focused, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say you're not just going to be a servant leader if you just focus on doing it at work. You have to find a way to live it in your life. And if you live it in your life, it'll be easier to do it in your work.
Yeah.
So for me, that is serving scouting, serving in Rotary. Those are things that are outside of my day job, public service, perhaps.
Yeah.
Those are outside of my day job where I'm involved for a greater good or a public good outside of, what just affects me. And if you do that, you're expanding your experience with doing things for service sake.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we think about motivation, I go back to one of our previous guests, Sparkle Sanders. She had come and done a session with my team, and she does all this work on leadership, and I think it's sort of in the John Maxwell frame of leadership. But one of the types of leadership they talk about that is servant leadership, and she asked somebody in the room to volunteer to say, give an example of someone who they thought was a servant leader. And one of my team members stood up and took the little card and came over and handed it to me and said, Chris is.
Really?
And I was shocked. I was actually shocked because I don't think I'd ever seen myself through that lens of servant leadership. But I think, James, to your point, I had done scouts. I had done other volunteer things. Like, service to others was a part of me. And I just wasn't seeing myself through that lens because I think I've spent a lot of my professional life advocating for myself. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. And it's just been in the last probably 5 to 10 years that I've started to change that. So I don't necessarily think of myself as a servant leader. I think maybe it just comes a little bit naturally to me. So I don't have to be as intentional about it.
Yeah. Sometimes you don't see how others perceive you.
Yeah. I was truly shocked. I think I actually got a little bit choked up, which is not unusual for me. But it was this really special moment that people saw me as somebody who was really taking care of the organization and not just focused on my own personal advancement and kind of personal leadership impact.
So are there other actions that people that are listening or watching today can take to be more lead like a servant?
I think for me, it is really just thinking about what is good for the organization, and not just what you think is good and what is good for you. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the question you have to ask. And if you interject that question into your decision-making process, not to paralyze you in your decision-making process, but just especially for the big decisions, right? You don't have to do this for every little decision all day long. But for the big decisions, really be thinking through that organizational lens, through the lens of, is this going to be good for the people in our organization? Is this going to be good for our organizational outcomes? That's the criteria that I would use.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for developing humility, because that's something that maybe not everybody comes with, and I think it's something something you can learn. To your point, Chris, I think I've talked to you about this before, but one of the challenges that I have as a leader is when what I think is the right decision seems to be of value to me personally. And I get caught at times in like overanalyzing whether I'm doing this to serve myself or I'm doing this to serve the organization. And it's not just how I feel about it, it's how it will be perceived. So sometimes I go down the rabbit hole too much, justifying certain things because I don't want it to come across as I'm building an empire or I'm doing things for my own end. And it's not, I don't think it's completely fair to say you should ignore that as a person who's trying to grow and expand your career. You have to do some of those things. But if you're introspective about it, that's where humility is clicking in to make sure you're checking your reasons and asking yourself, am I doing this for the right reason?
Yeah, that's a really, I think, good way of looking at that. But I would caution you, and I think you understand this about yourself, like don't overanalyze that, because I think we think of servant leadership and individual advancement or what's good for you in your career as this binary decision, and it's not, right? If you're truly a servant leader and you're doing what's good for the organization, that will end up being good for you individually. And so you're not having to set yourself aside in this process.
Yeah, I'll add that, managing ego is something that a leader has to think about, right? Mm-hmm. And
I don't know anything about that.
not pointing any fingers here. But sometimes a team needs a strong ego to push through things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To pull them through things. And so you can't say, no, don't do that. Suppress your ego all the time. You have to find, like in everything, you have to find balance.
Yeah. I have a sticker on my desk that actually says, don't let your ego become someone else's headwind. Right. And if it's a tailwind, an ego can be a great thing. You just don't want it to be the organizational headwind. So it's along those lines. How does servant leadership coexist with high performance and strong results? Right. We think of these like really high performing organizations. They have this leader that just drives them to success. That's more of a traditional look at things. In your experiences, where has servant leadership really like pushed performance and results?
Well, I know that the team is always happier when they understand what they've done to get to where they're going. And a servant leader is always lifting up the performance and the contribution of all of their members. And so the celebration at success is that much richer. And you end up managing your turnover if you have a culture of servant leadership, because people are gravitating towards that.
Yeah.
They feel supported in that. They trust the person in charge, and that's important. We know how important it is to trust the person in charge and what it can do to the soul of an organization or a country when a lot of people are not comfortable with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw a little tangential thing in there.
Yeah. Go for it.
If that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
sorry, I didn't mean to step on you.
No, it's okay.
But,
I was thinking of a specific example, so go for it.
Being coached or being mentored is an important part of servant leadership.
Say more.
Because you need someone who is to the side and can look at what you're doing and help you see when you're blind to maybe personal motivations or making a choice that is not serving your group. And the best person to do that is someone you've built a relationship with and maybe not is in the middle of what you're doing, but is there to help you work through it. And that's what I think it's hard to say a servant leader is a good servant leader if they can't tell you who their mentor is or who their coach is.
That's interesting.
Because they're not being humble and letting someone else help them find their path.
Right. I've always said the greatest value of a leadership coach or some other professional coach is that they don't let you believe your own BS. Right. And that's essentially what you're saying. They check you. And that's a really important thing to have, especially with servant leadership. I hadn't thought about it through that lens, but I think that's really important because they're the ones that are going to ask you the right questions to know whether or not you're really serving the organization or are you serving yourself.
I mean, of course, a servant leader hasn't gotten there by themselves. So that does make sense that they had to have some assistance from someone.
So we're sitting here talking about this servant leadership thing, and it sounds like we have all the answers. How hard is this to do? Like, what are the hardest parts of practicing this?
The hardest parts of practicing servant leadership? For me, it's the active listening part is the hardest part for me personally.
Yeah.
But that's just me personally because I, as you know, talk a lot. And when one talks a lot, it's harder sometimes to talk less and listen.
Yeah. Especially when people are talking really slowly, right?
I hate slow talkers.
Yeah. So James, for you, like, what's the hardest part?
Oh, no. Clearly for me, it's getting out of my own head when I'm trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, because I want to be sure.
Yeah.
I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to let people down. That's a feature of being a servant leader. You don't want to let people down. And so not over analyzing it, trust your experience, I have probably 5 coaches and 2 mentors, and I need them all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, I think it's not letting my confidence get quick to solution, right? The right answer is normally in the room, not in my head. And so it's a matter of, when we encounter a problem as an organization, my first inclination is, I know how to fix that. But I really have to squelch that and then put it out there. And it may end up coming back to the exact same answer I had in the beginning, but you're making sure that it's a good answer for the organization rather than the one that you just think is the good answer.
I really love it when a team member has an idea that I think is the right answer that I was thinking about, and they bring it to the table.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Because then they can get the credit for it.
They should get the credit for it because they came to it too. Yeah. But then it's not like that, again, back to that hierarchical.
Yeah.
This is James's idea, so we got to do James's idea. That's not where we want to be.
I remember there was a moment with our team. This was several years ago. It was pre-pandemic. And the team was struggling to come to an answer on some technical solution. And I noticed that, and I had sent a calendar invite to the people that were involved in this decision, and the topic was on it, with no other explanation to why we were having this meeting. I wasn't in the room, but someone shared with me afterwards that invite came in, and somebody stood up, and it was a shared office space. Somebody stood up and said, "We need to figure this out before this meeting, or else Chris is going to tell us how to solve this." Right. And that, those types of incidents, those moments remind me that sometimes I can get too far out ahead of myself on these things. But it also motivated them to come to an answer. And it was actually a different answer than I would have come up with. And it was a better answer. And so, maybe kicking the organization a little bit in that direction is a good thing and does serve the organization.
So can I ask one final question since we're getting kind of close to the end?
Yeah.
So James, I'm curious, because we haven't had you on the podcast before, what's one leadership lesson that stayed with you throughout your career that you want to share?
I've shared this with a number of people through the MORE program. They ask you to go through your leadership moments and over time, and we use that in the IT leadership workshop. But the important thing that I learned was when I was transitioning from someone who was being mostly led to being a person mostly doing the leading. And it was tied to an important time in my life when I lost my parents. And I realized how much of a role my mom had played, both, she's my mom, right? That's the core thing. But she was also a consummate professional in higher education. And I could always go to her and ask questions. And I had lost my mentor, who was also my mom. And it made me both comfortable with the idea that I still needed mentorship and I had to find it somewhere else. But it was also at a time where, I was in my 40s and I had to think, it's time for me to be doing that for others. And it came at the time that I went through the IT Leaders Program and we started talking about creating the IT Leadership Workshop. And it was just that moment of, I need to change this from taking or getting leadership and mentorship to I need to be focusing more on sharing it. And I think that's a service leadership kind of moment. And it has stuck with me and I'm really happy to where it's led.
Thank you, James. I think that's a perfect way for us to finish up today.
Yeah, thank you so much, James, for being on the show. You have worked with Candice and me for years, putting on the IT Leadership Workshop on campus, and I can't think of a better guest to have launched our first guest of season 2. So, thanks for joining us and giving us your thoughts on servant leadership. And to our viewers and listeners, if you've got any questions on servant leadership or comments or examples from your own life, feel free to leave them in the comments and let us know.
Yeah, I've been glad to do it. And I do need to thank you for the technology community on campus. This is a great forum that you guys have put out there because people have these questions and wonder about these things, and you're putting it out there. So thank you guys for giving your time and your effort to make it happen.
Yeah, it's tons of fun to do. So glad to do it.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.